My name is Andrea Douglas, and I'm the executive director here at the Jefferson School African American Heritage Center. I want to welcome you all this evening and thank you for joining us both here in the center and online streaming. We're doing a hybrid conversation today. I really appreciate the fact that you all are coming back to the center. We miss you. It's not the same. 2 years of Zoom looking out into the void has been weird. So I want to really express my thanks for you all coming. I know that you all could be doing many other things with your Friday evenings, but choose to be here with us. And so we are greatly appreciative. Tonight, we continue our Evelyn Barbour lectures with a conversation with my new friend, Davarian Baldwin. The Evelyn Barbour lectures are named after Evelyn Barbour, who was a mentor to me. She was an educator. She was an alumni of the Jefferson School. She was a teacher and a devoted supporter of the idea of this place. And so we are honored to be able to name a lecture after her. If you've been with us at other series, what we try and do is think about one idea through a series of conversations. This year, we're thinking about reparations. We're thinking about truth and repair and what that means. This set of conversations is in relationship to a group of people who have been meeting together since about 2018, after we came back from a civil rights pilgrimage that some of us took to take soil collected from the lynching site of John Henry James and bring it to Montgomery, to the Equal Justice Initiative, so that he could have a final resting place there. On our way, we stopped off in Greensboro, where we met with people from the beloved community. Our experience at that moment was moving, important, and we all thought it was something that we needed to do here in Charlottesville. So the group, about 80 or so loosely, sometimes it's 30 people deeply involved, have been meeting to try and come up with an idea about what would it mean to do truth and repair in Charlottesville. And so the Heritage Center has taken on this conversation as a way of educating that group, but also educating the larger community about what this conversation really is. And we're hoping and with this conversation have brought to Charlottesville people who are at the leading edge of that discussion. So let me introduce our guest tonight, our esteemed guest, Davarian Baldwin. Davarian Baldwin is a leading urbanist, historian, and cultural critic. His work largely examines the landscape of global cities through the lens of the African diasporic experience. Baldwin's related interests include universities and urban development, the racial foundations of academic thought, intellectual and mass culture, Black radical thought, and transnational social movements, the politics of heritage tourism, and 20th and 21st century art, architecture, and urban design. He is the author of The Shadow of the Ivory Tower, or In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower, How Universities Are Plundering Our Cities, which will be the basis of our conversation today. He is also author of Chicago's New Negroes, Modernity, The Great Migration and Black Urban Life from UNC Press from 2007, and co-editor with Minka Makalani of the essay collection Escape from New York, The New Negro Renaissance Beyond Harlem, published in 2013. He's got a very distinguished biography. I'm just going to name just a little bit more. At Trinity, Baldwin's teaching brings together urban and cultural studies, the 20th century US history, and African American studies. He's also the founding director of the Smart Cities Research Lab, housed in the Center for Urban and Global Studies on campus. His research, writing, and commentary has been featured in numerous outlets, including NBC News, CNN, PBS, the History Channel, NPR, on and on and on. So, Davarian, thanks for being with us tonight.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And I just want to give respect to Evelyn, Barbour, and the importance of educators that are also community historians, because the work that I do would not be possible without people like that. And I thank you, Dr. Douglas, and also thank you, Celeste, for being such a wonderful host on my time being here after 20 years. So it's a pleasure to be here, so thank you.
Oh, thank you for coming and helping us expand the conversation. For some of us, this is a new conversation. For some of us, for others, we've been in this conversation for a long time, and sometimes clarity is not always there, you know?
Yeah.
So I appreciate your being here to help us think about it. So why don't we start out with the book? Tell me, why don't we talk a little bit about what In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower is about? How would you describe that?
Yeah, so I've been an academic my whole life, even before I was an academic, just in terms of like loving books, going to pre-college programs, always been at the Ivory Tower, so back from a fashion. So the story I tell here was with me my whole life, whether it was at, being in Milwaukee, Wisconsin at Marquette University, or as a postdoctoral fellow here in Charlottesville, or living in New York City, going to graduate school in New York. So the story that I tell has always been with me, but it was a moment about 17 years ago when I was at the University of Chicago conducting historical research. And I came outside, to get a breath, and history smacked me straight in the face. It was unfolding right there before my eyes. What happened? I heard chants and protests in the air, and I followed the sound to the administration building at the University of Chicago, and there was a group of African Americans from the historic neighborhood of Bronzeville to the near north of the campus with signs that said, "U of C, look at your history, stop cultural piracy." And I asked what was going on, and they were like, the University of Chicago has not only entered into a conversation about trying to preserve the historic blues club called the Checkerboard Lounge, but they have begun the process of purchasing it and picking it up and relocating it from the Black neighborhood into the commercial corridor of the college neighborhood of Hyde Park. And so when I heard this story, I was like, what's going on? And talking to people more in depth, like, you Chicago's, they controlled the south side of Chicago since their inception in 1892. They controlled everything around here. And so I began to tell friends and colleagues as I went back to New York at the time, and they were like, well, yeah, this story is all around us. We live with this story. We don't talk about it. The degree to which universities and their medical centers control so many aspects of largely the Black and brown neighborhoods that surround campuses. And like, if you're gonna talk about Chicago, you're gonna talk about New York, NYU, Columbia, you gotta talk about, South Central, USC, and Emory in Atlanta, and Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, and UPenn in Philadelphia, and Yale and New Haven. The list went on and on and on. And what I thought was this novel story was a national phenomenon. The degree and the ways in which higher education has taken grand control over the economic development and political governance of our cities and towns, or what I call the rise of universe cities. So, yeah.
So I'm interested in this idea. You mentioned the 1890s, and for us here in Charlottesville, it goes even further back,
Sure.
right?
Yes.
Jefferson built his university in the 1820s, right? And in many of the places that you've listed, New York, Emory, places like that, there is this place where land and the institution of enslavement and all of those kinds of histories and those constructs are associated with that. So let's talk a little bit about that place. Let's talk a little bit about the land to begin with, right? And this relationship to African American people, African people of the diaspora. How is this kind of monopoly of space that when you talk about medical centers and universities, how has that grown into a threat that imposes on the surrounding community.
Yeah, so just to take your comment in two parts. So talk about slavery first, and then talk about land, and they'll be related, obviously.
Right.
So my good colleague, Craig Wilder, who wrote this magisterial book called Evelyn and Ivory, set the tone for this conversation more broadly. And even schools up north that were seen untouched by slavery, like my own institution of Trinity College. His book opens with my school before I even went that, taught that school. So there's that. There's, if you go to Harvard, there still are these quarters in the student dorms. You wonder, what is that extra quarter for? It's for their slave servants. And we know that if you go to the grounds right here in UVA, there's these floorboards that can be pulled back. And they were these housing and holding pens for slave servants. So they could be readily available for service, but invisible when it came to the student lifestyle. And we can see it today, the invisibility of Black labor, but its centrality to making, this be the hottest livable city in the country. Black labor does that. And it goes back to the origins of the academical village with Thomas Jefferson, just to be clear about that.
Right.
So if you want to bring this to the question that you mentioned about land, land takes place in at least two ways in terms of first of all this is unceded indigenous land, just point blank period. But then when we get to the 1890s and 1860s and 1890s, we have this thing called the Morrill Act. It didn't really affect UVA to the same degree, but all these land grant institutions, so like a Virginia Tech or University of Minnesota or what have you, these land grant institutions, they come online, their endowment comes from basically taking land from indigenous communities and using the money that was generated from that land to create endowments for these institutions. So the land issue from indigenous displacement and the labor issue from enslaved labor, and my great colleague Hillary Green at the University of Alabama is doing these fabulous tours to show how the labor of Black folk made that possible. My other colleague I went to graduate school with, Abel Wilson, who was a graduate here. She had a hand in the memorial.
Right.
And she's doing work on the slave roots of the labor that made the academic village possible. And we know that the neighborhood directly outside, the historic neighborhood directly outside of the academic village was called Canada, the historic Black neighborhood. They were the service class for the gentries that made up this school. So we look at that, that kind of original story. And then we go forward to the 20th century. That the very land that was charged for urban renewal, Vinegar Hill, Gospel Hill around the hospital, these are precisely the areas that were Black chocolate cities.
Right. People
forget the degree to which Charlottesville is chocolate city. That Tipton Page and Gospel Hill, all that area, those are the Blackest neighborhoods in the city. And so it's not surprising that they become as well as Vinegar Hill, that these become the right targets for state-sponsored displacement and wealth extraction, that then all these areas become the sites today for high-end land revitalization through med tech, supplemental secondary industries, laboratories, private lab laboratories, live, work, plays, the developments like the dairy market or the wall of housing that is on West Main, the landmark, the Lux, and I can't get to the Standard, Mud House, the extension of the downtown mall. These are all sites that were Black.
Right.
And so because of a history of connecting race and land value, they become the sites that are targets for contemporary revitalization without Black people. So we say more about that, but I just want to lay that down at least to clarify that this prosperity we're seeing is built on what we call Black gold, which is really Black impoverishment, Black displacement, Black extraction, wealth extraction. That's the connection. It's direct. It's not secondary. It's not speculative. It's not fantastical. It's not conspiratorial. We have the receipts. It's direct.
So I think what you've done very nicely for us is locate this conversation here in Charlottesville and created for us a kind of historic arc, right? That allows us to say that this is not episodic, that there is a continuation of a kind of methodology where the university sits at the center of that, right?
And it's important because in some cities where I have these conversations, when you talk about the university, it becomes an opportunity to say, oh, well, that's them, that's not us. But in places like Charlottesville, I mean, even in New York City today, you can't talk about Charlottesville without talking about UVA.
Right.
In terms of its government, past mayors, almost the entire city planning office is pulled from graduates of the architecture school. The housing here is almost directly driven by studentification, we call studentification, if not directly, indirectly in terms of the workforce that comes to work at the medical schools, the secondary industries in terms of the tech laboratories, the pharmaceutical, life science investments, workshops. All this is either directly or indirectly tied to either being on grounds or wanting to be near the grounds. So the story of Charlottesville today is a story of UVA. So it's one and the same. You can't escape it. You can't get away from it.
So let me, within the context of the conversations that we've been having, we first started out with Frank Wilderson's book, Afro-Pessimism, right? And in Frank's book, he actually sort of creates a similar kind of historic arc. He's basically saying that there is a very clear experiential discourse around the lives of Black people, so that if you wanted to have a conversation about repair, that you would have to understand that this is a very specific kind of conversation, right? So talk to me a little bit about, and you began it. We're sort of beginning to tease this all out. But for me, in the work that we've been doing, one of the things that we've been trying to do is articulate, when you're talking about Black gold, the expanse of what that Black land looks like, right? And in our environment, it is decidedly proximate. And in some ways, the university is interior to it. Right? Because Black business builds up around these institutions. So let's talk about that. How does the interiority of the institution work with this overall arc of history and the specificity of that Black cultural space?
So that's helpful. Thank you. So, between 1965 and just to be real specific, between 1965 and 1975, we see the UVA student population double from about 7,000 to 15,000. Yet there is very little on-campus housing built. So then, in around that same time, in between 2000 and 2017, out of the 5,000 undergraduate students, 4,000 of them are sent out into the private housing market. So speculators and investors seize on that because they can take, say, a single family home and cut it up into what we call a mini dorm. Individual rooms become its own unit. And so it's more operative to sell to 5 or 6 students in a single family home than it is to keep a single family, working class family that had once been in there. So we take that and we look at tented page, for example. What does do tented page between 2000 and over the last 2 decades? Between 2000 and the present. So what this means then is because housing prices are going up, and the university is bringing in more students and more workers, but they are not building equal housing. So this has a profound impact on land pressures that do well for speculators and developers, but it's horrible for long-standing residents. So we say tented page, we mean Black. Let's be clear. Like, let's not talking code. This is a Black neighborhood directly adjacent to the expansion of the university, where students are looking for cheap housing because of the history of land depression because of the relationships between race and land value that go back a century. So what this means on the ground is that the population of the entire city of Charlottesville in the last 2 decades has decreased from 22% to 18%. But in the Page neighborhood, it has plummeted from 72% to 57%, while the value or the cost of rental properties goes up from $650 to about $999. So what does this mean? Land pressures, attractive for students, impossible for the long-standing Black residents of these communities. And so the only way that these residents return is with their nose pressed to the glass of these horrible these mammoth constructions of glass, steel, and false brick. They come back to serve the food and clean the floors. And there is a long history of the predominant workforce on campus being Black women that face harassment, that face compressed wages, that face not just sexual harassment, but mistreatment by their bosses. Over the years, there have been at least 2 or 3 student-based hunger strikes to call for better treatment of these workers over the years. So the point here in my framework of universities is that UVA is a tech. Even when I was here 20 years ago, I didn't see this, but writing this book last year, UVA is a textbook case of the university because it's this land control. Let's be clear, we know this, and your former mayor asked the question. We knew this all along, but she dared ask the question publicly, why are these universities property tax exempt? Mm-hmm. And so then as the university expands, it's everything that's considered educational purposes falls under the cover of that tax exemption. So what does this mean? This means not just the classrooms, not just the dorms, but also the laboratories where you have these public-private partnerships with pharmaceutical companies that are producing research and development and multi-million-dollar patents through intellectual property that comes back to this university in the form of royalties. All that is covered by property tax exemptions. Let's be clear, that's for-profit work. It should not be covered by property tax exemptions. But who are the county assessors? Graduates of UVA. Or their peers. The university leadership are peers with city leadership. They're not going to ask the question. It's going to require community members to ask the question. We need the assessors to come in and do some forensic accounting about what is actually not profit and what is for profit on these grounds. And what the consequence of that is therefore the property tax monies that are not being paid, where does that money go to? Public schools, trash removal, infrastructure, all the things that keep communities going, while at the same time, the residents are being priced out and are facing increased transportation costs, living further out in the county, to have to come back in to the university that suppresses labor organizing, so they don't get a $15 or a living wage. And there's no workforce housing in the area. So all these elements become mechanisms of extraction. Then you include the health facilities. They do some of that for-profit research. They get a tax abatement or a tax exemption on the condition that they provide indigent care for surrounding communities. But then you get to the funny numbers. They're never really clear about how they serve these communities. And instead of serving the communities, they shift from community hospitals and clinics to high-end, profitable boutique services like plastic surgery and cancer research, where they still keep the tax exemption without offering the indigent care. And then the final piece in the pièce de résistance is the policing. Former police chief, I'm sure the police chief here now, he's the head of UVA Police, Tom Lingo, who was formerly the chief of the city of Charlottesville, who testified on behalf of the killers of Freddie Gray in Baltimore, recently advocated for the extended jurisdiction of UVA police into residential neighborhoods. So the police become the front line in controlling space and land that will eventually be followed by the brick and mortar of campus buildings, laboratories, and high-end, amenity-rich housing for students, faculty, and lab workers. So this larger framework becomes this powerful impact on various forms of wealth extraction and political control that is built on Black labor and Black displacement, and yet they don't benefit. Black folks don't benefit from any of this.
So what I find interesting about this is that this is happening here, and you've listed a number of other places.
Right.
So can we describe this as a national phenomenon? Talk to me a little bit about how that looks as an overall economic, American economic plan then based on your research.
So the question becomes, in short, what happened? How did we get here? How did universities become the new factories? So in the 1950s and 60s, and this is a story that we know about UVA nationally, we all know the story of capital flying to the suburbs and only white people being allowed to follow because suburban areas were covered by restrictive covenants or just straight bold-faced Jim Crow in the South. You can damn not can't enter these neighborhoods. So the capital, the wealth of factories in the county regions is not accessible by African Americans. Even if they fought in the war and had access to GI money, they couldn't get access to basically what we call welfare housing, right? Single family housing that created the American middle class. So we have that story. We all know that story. But the part we don't talk about with the universities is that universities wanted to follow, but they couldn't because they were too big. Almost every story I tell about, including UVA, there was a desire for the university to leave the city at these moments of urban crisis. Almost every city you can find this story. They couldn't leave, so what they did was they lobbied the federal government to give them urban renewal money. For every dollar that they contributed, the federal government would contribute $2 to develop any to demolish areas around universities in the name of urban renewal to protect the value of these higher education institutions. This is federal policy. Displaced Black and brown communities all over the country. Again, a national story. So, but by the time we get to the 90s, and I'll be real quick, there is a turn back into the city. What we call the back to the city movement. The children, or more accurately, the grandchildren of suburban sprawl are bored with the anonymity, the homogeneity of suburban life. They want to come back to the city. City government's like, oh yeah, I lived in New York at this time, in the 90s. Rudolph Giuliani's quality of life campaign, pushing people with mental illnesses out of sanitariums and turning them into high-end housing. They wanted that capital base, right? What were their ideas about city life, these suburbanites? Density, walkability, lectures, libraries, museums, essentially what? A campus. On the other side, you got universities saying, wait a minute, the states are contributing less and less money to us. They're diminishing their contributions. Right now, a lot of states only contribute about 20% to state universities. So they had to become entrepreneurial. They got into the real estate game heavy. That's one thing. Later, they got into the science tech game that we're dealing with right now. So what I'm saying is, on one side, you have city governments trying to capture these tax revenues of these returning urbanites. On the other side, you got universities looking for new revenue streams. What they have in common is the conversion of city blocks into versions of a campus. So, University Village and USC, Harper Court in Chicago, Cortex in St. Louis, U City Square in Philadelphia, the shops at Yale in New Haven, the downtown mall at UVA. These all become amenity-rich commercial corridors as ways to capture this university-related residential and retail base that begins to come into the cities in the 90s. In my experience in New York City, this was the front line of this was quality life policing, kicking out poor people. They spent more than 5 minutes in the ATM vestibule, locking up squeegee boys. These quality life crimes get duplicated. That policy They go on the road. Giuliani and his chief of police go on the road. They go global, not just national, but global, in how to reproduce this whole framework, clearing house of these cities. We see people developing waterfront developments. Mm-hmm. So this becomes a national story, and the university becomes the center of this as a facilitator of capital, of land control, of policing, of healthcare, all in the name of the public good. Because we presume that anything a university does is for the public good. But the public good becomes this powerful mechanism. I call it the public good paradox, most clearly demonstrated in the tax code. Because we presume that higher ed is offering a public good, that in every state they are identified as a nonprofit, which means they're property tax exempt. This becomes the cover whereby universities can extract resources through the tax abatement in other ways from their surrounding communities, their host cities, to develop their for-profit interests with very little public oversight or public scrutiny. So this became a way to do this business. And so it's not a mistake that when you have graduates of UVA's architecture school coming into city government and UVA wants to extend and create that wall of housing on West Main or that little city behind the hospital, there wasn't much pushback. And then if you want to ask questions about, well, is it on tax rolls? Or how's it being taxed? Or what are the conditions of the workers that come to clean the floors? There wasn't much question, because the presumption is that, well, look, we're the most livable city. You know, the magazine said. So we're not going to ask questions. This is all good. This is revitalization. But it's true, there's been prosperity. We can see the hotels, we can see the restaurants, but for who? For who? Those who ceded the land, those who were displaced, they have no part or very little part. You know, we always have a couple of black faces in high places. We point to them and say, oh, look, they're doing it, but they're doing it without any concern for the well-being of the everyday working class African American resident. There's a Faustian bargain. In exchange for this prosperity, you can't bring it from your cousins in the back door. So we see that in every city. We see it right here. And so, real quickly, and so there's prosperity, but the question becomes for who? What public? Public good for which public? That's the question we need. And this is where reparations comes in as a critical question, as a provocation for thinking about reconstructing this entire dynamic that we've been laying out for the last 20 minutes.
So here's, I want to hold that.
Yeah, for sure.
Because there was something that you said that reminded me of the sort of transient nature of the universities. Mm-hmm. So here you're creating a structure for generally people who are only going to be here for 4 years.
Yeah.
Right? Or here you're creating a structure that ultimately becomes so attractive to those people who are going to be here for 4 years that they stay for 5 or 6 or 7, and they become part of the sort of economic space. Right.
But the space they want to become part of is something that's very similar to what they just left in terms of the college experience. So basically what you have is a multiplication of, frat life, fun times throughout your entire city. With the housing, with the labs, with the commercial development. It's an extension of that college experience. Just wanted to put that in there,
No, and I think that's partly where I was going, right?
Okay,
what does it mean when you, because as you're describing for me, the ways in which, infrastructure moves into community.
Yeah.
But then there's also those actual people.
Yes.
When you talk about those bodies.
Yes.
I remember when the state of Virginia had a hiring freeze. I think it was maybe 2008. I was still at the university. Mm-hmm. So 2008, in response, the university brought in more students, as you said, right?
Yeah.
And with no housing. But those students, they also increased the number of classes they were offering. So suddenly school ended in May, then there was class in June, right. And then there was class in July,
right.
Which basically extended the term of university life.
Right.
And then it became nice to live here.
Right.
Right.
That's right.
So there's also a different kind of, there's a physical displacement in the land, but there's also a way in which people
Yeah.
who were once transient are now no longer transient as a consequence.
And so they also change lifestyle. They call the police for noise ordinances. They over police areas where they want access to. We have a whole neighborhood full of Karens, if you will, just to be colloquial, right? So they start measuring the length of the grass, and they start making complaints about siding, aluminum siding, or about fence lines. And so they produce neighborhoods and blocks in their own image without any regard for the indigenous lifestyles. They don't act as neighbors, they act as lords, as feudal lords. That these local blocks should be made in their image or in their desire or as a root replication of their experience on the grounds. And so this has a direct and a more insidious and impersonal or informal impact on the livelihood of the long-term residents of these communities. So you begin to see the multiplication of certain design elements, this false muddy brick, faux brick look. Everything is glass and steel. These fake open spaces that are enclosed on three sides. So you have very limited adaptive reuse. So maybe a water tower is so we can go, down by the train tracks, those new towns at $1.2 million. The water tower is the only thing from the past that is still there, and that kicks in public money because it's considered historic preservation. Yet the homes are 1.2 million facing the train tracks. So it becomes another form of wealth extraction and tax evasion at the hands of public engagement just in name, but not in actuality. These are the consequences for the host community.
So, reparations.
Yes.
Let's talk about that.
Yes.
Yeah.
You are.
Okay. So you wrote the article, The Reparations Movement in Higher Education.
Mm-hmm.
And you said reparations has become not simply a call to reckon with the past, as you began to say, alone, but a beacon to chart the course for a shared future.
Yeah.
Tell me what that means.
Yeah. So, in fact, UVA is the headquarters of this institution. So, for decades, talking about Evelyn and Barbour, for example, for decades, community historians have been talking about the slave roots of various universities. And universities have been denying that, pushing it back until it was no longer deniable. And then Ruth Simmons at Brown University said, this is true. And all of a sudden it became legitimate. And then a couple of years later, universities are like, okay, we can't deny this anymore. So we gotta deal with this. So what can we do? We can have a commission. We can have some research. And so UVA became the national headquarters for universities studying, that's clear, universities studying slavery. So schools were cool with talking about slavery and studying it. But my work showed that the impact of racialized harm and displacement and policing and wealth extraction take place well into the 20th century. Talking about the ways in which the university underwrote restrictive covenants or underwrote Jim Crow policies in the US South, or the ways in which the 1950s they became the friendly face of urban renewal, or today the way in which they deploy their police and their control of land and labor as a creation of racialized lifestyle bubbles in these areas. So the legacy goes on and on up to the present. They don't want to talk about that, right? They don't talk about how the current prosperity is built on decades of harm and displacement. So reparations about the future is what I mean. So there's been a moment where the current conditions are kind of colorblind. So you talk about, increased housing values. It's just a market force. Health disparities, past harm. Yes, we know about the lead paint studies in Baltimore. We know that we offered Jim Crow health offers in the 50s, but we don't do that anymore. Now we have DEI. We have a whole DEI division, right? So my point is that reparations is not just about studying or memorializing past harms, but it's about coming to terms with how today's current prosperity is profoundly racialized, if not only for the ways in which it's built on past harm, but it reinforces and creates new harms in the present moment. That even in the world without factories, if we talk about these knowledge factories with these labs, with these restaurants, you go to the dairy market that used to be a warehouse or a workspace. All the owners and the consumers are white, and the service workers are black. You can see, for me, 20 years ago and before that, an overlay of a certain landscape from the plantation to the factory to the extension of the campus. The same dynamics. When I used to run on Main Street 20 years ago, I would see these buses let off, cross the tracks, letting off black women to go work in the hospital. And it just like a boomerang effect of the similar dynamics. And you go into these restaurants, and it's not overt, but you go down the mall, the downtown mall. Black people aren't consuming. They're not consumers in the mall. Unless they're faculty or maybe high-end folk. It's not an open, it's open architecturally, but socioeconomically, the price points, the way policing and surveillance works, it's not an open space. So my point about repair is that in the same way that the current socioeconomic and political framework has been set up, built on Black and brown and working class displacement and despair, those very same areas need to be targeted for the redistribution of wealth. Not as a one-time gift, not as a monument, not as a tutoring program. What else do universities do? Not as a turkey giveaway on Thanksgiving, not as a clothing drive on Christmas, but as a complete reconstruction of the budget with an awareness of how the very wealth that they hold comes from their neighboring host communities in the present. This means things like payments in lieu of taxes, pay your taxes. A clear charging and forcing the county or the city assessor to go onto these campuses and to do a clear assessment about what for-profit work is happening and to take the taxes and put them in our communities, for the schools, for indigenous business incubators. This means city and university budgets annually earmarking millions of dollars to compensate for the destruction that came with Vinegar Hill, Gospel Hill, and what's happening right now with 10th and Page. Right? So these are just to begin. That if you're a university like UVA with a multi-million-dollar endowment, and they will say this needs to last the lifetime of the institution, as if they don't get donations and tuition every year. So let's just take these schools are required to spend 5% of their endowment to maintain taxes, because yes, the endowment is also tax exempt. And they spend more money right now. They spend more money on the money market manager, because the whole endowment is in a money market. They spend more money on the money market manager than they do on community development, community investment. So on top of the 5%, just add an additional 3%. That would be hundreds of thousands, even millions of dollars, but reserve it specifically for community investment in real terms. That would be governed by a community oversight board, not advisory, because we've seen that game. We get together, we spend hours after work poring over records. We offer a recommendation, and the university or city said, well, you're an advisory board. Thank you for your advisement. We'll do what we want. So not advisory, oversight board with power. That's the beginning. Community land trust. Any public land that is being developed or being speculated upon for private development, if you're developing there, it has to include a certain amount of affordable units, not at 80% or 120% AMI, average median income, which includes the county, but at 40 or 50% AMI. Yes, I said it, right? 40 or 50% AMI with zip code specifically targeting historically displaced communities. So these are the kinds of things that I'm talking about. Something very basic. Every day, because of the health code, the university has to throw out tons of food. During the pandemic, some schools began to package this food into healthy meals for communities in need. Why isn't that daily? That's something very simple to do. But the university doesn't think about community engagement in terms of actual community needs. It thinks about community engagement in terms of brand management. How much will we have to do to maintain our good image in the higher education marketplace? So the point here means that any of this work has to be governed by community oversight. University recreational spaces, common spaces, have them governed by, because this is a state school, have them governed by a community charter. So many hours per day in peak hours have to be reserved for community organizations to use for however they want. Right? These things are well within our reach. And that's just the beginning of the conversation. And to be clear, these things I'm talking about, they're not coming out of pie in the sky. I'm not making these things up. At the end of the book, I talk about the University of Winnipeg in Canada. Some of these things I draw from that story, but also I draw some of these things from stories from Black social movements, student and community movements in the 60s and 70s. From community colleges like Merritt College, the home of the Black Panther Party, Malcolm X Community College in Chicago, City University of New York. These were schools, community colleges with working class Black and Latinx residents and community members and students that were calling for the things I'm talking about, right? Firing off-duty city cops and hiring Black-owned unarmed security teams, creating prison annexes for incarcerated residents, making schools not just free in tuition, but also open admissions with support services, because they argue that you are a state institution or a city institution and the public schools do a horrible job of preparing Black and brown students for the labor market, which they saw even in the 60s was going to become more information-based and not industrially based. You're going to prepare them for the new market. It's your job, city universities, state universities, to provide that service. The only way you can do that is not just free tuition, but also open admissions. So these are things that have happened, not just speculative science fiction. And they were Black and brown community led, and we got to return to that and retrofit it for the current moment. So this is what I mean by the beginnings of repair.
So, and by the way, I'm going to open this up in a minute for questions, because I know that you all have questions,
Yeah.
and I'm sure that there are questions online as well.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm struck by this notion of the beginnings,
Yeah.
right? Because I would say that some of us in the audience would say, okay, well, we have a university that's doing all of those things. Many of the things that you're describing are community engaged processes are here at the university.
Yeah.
They're moving into the community. They're trying to solve community problems. So I guess my question is, at what point is enough enough?
Yeah, it's never enough, because we're not talking about just solving a problem. We're talking about a new set of relationships. We're talking about rethinking the ecosystem of how the university and its host community relate and make each other possible. So that means that forever, there needs to be a new reorganization of the university budget. Forever, there need to be requirements. Not again, they're building affordable housing, but it's not at 50% AMI. So let me just be clear about that. So affordable housing in every development, community land trust on all public land. We're talking about what does it mean to be a just and equitable city. So the things I'm talking about are not just about higher education. It's about what is going to be the future of Charlottesville. That in the same way, we talked about this earlier, when they wanted to build a standard, when they wanted to extend and expand the downtown mall, they knew clearly what development practices had to go in place. and they got funders, they got city buy-in, they put out charrettes and invited people to not to consult, but to look. And they got it done. We know how development works. But the funny thing is that when you talk about these things, affordable housing, community land trust, all of a sudden developers don't know how to develop. What do you do? How do you do this? All of a sudden we don't know what to do. The same principles apply. When this country underwrote affordable, federally subsidized, single-family housing in the 50s and 60s to build the American middle class as white by building the suburbs, we knew what to do. But all of a sudden, when we're facing poverty, police violence, health disparities, we don't know what to do. It's the same principles apply. And it's not a one-time thing. This is about community investment. This is why I don't even use the word engagement. Because engagement suggests that we have something that you need and we're going to come in and solve the problem, instead of saying that, no, we're already intimately related. You have things because of us, because of what we don't have. There's a direct relationship here. It's what the old Latin American radicals used to call dependency theory, that there's a direct correlation between your prosperity and my poverty. And so we need to have a new retrofitting reorganization of that relationship. And these are some policies and practices that can help shift the needle. But we can't go in with the orientation of problem solving. That presumes a finite element. Then we go back to business as usual. No, we're talking about a reconstruction of the ecosystem, a rethinking of how we coexist. So that's what I'm calling for.
So I'm going to open it up to questions. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Dr. Baldwin.
Yeah, thank you.
I've got a question. Recently in New Haven,
Yes.
there was a successful effort to get Yale to participate in a payment in lieu of taxes program, or pilot program. I don't know, like 90 million a year, something like that. What was successful about that campaign? How did they do it? How can we replicate that?
First, your last word. What is Steve? How you doing? I'm proud to say that was part of that campaign. That just real quickly. First of all, Yale. This is why pilots are not the answer alone. Yale contributes the largest pilot in America already at $14 million a year. But this is built on if they're the biggest property holder in the city of New Haven. So if they were actually paying taxes, they would owe $157 million a year. Okay? And their endowment during the pandemic skyrocketed from $30 billion to $40 billion. Just to give you some numbers. So, but in the face of that, a coalition called New Haven Rising, that's actually 20 years old, almost 30 years old now, came out of Connecticut Center for a New Economy. They understood that Yale is so pervasive in the lives of New Haven residents that they touch the labor, they touch the land, they touch the healthcare, touch the policing. So the coalition is made up of all those constituencies. It includes community residents. It includes Unite Here, which is the primary labor organization that organizes on the campus. It includes students, and also it includes a strong faction of city governors, city council members. City council a couple years ago there was a major shift to begin to vote for those who had a background in labor organizing. So what you might call city council people, they call alders. So it was this concerted coalition of figures. And then they brought in people like me to write op-eds, to join rallies, to have conversations. It was a grassroots campaign. They knocked on doors. They talked to people saying, do you know what this money goes to? There was teach-ins, There were educational sessions. They went to public schools. They brought in school teachers. The reason why you have 10-year-old books is because Yale doesn't pay property taxes. They spoke, and so it was heavy, long-term groundwork. And so ultimately what they were able to do, and Yale ignored them for years. But during the pandemic, there was nowhere to hide in a certain kind of way. And so they were able to, and again, it's small, but they were able to push Yale to increase their pilot contribution an additional $10 million over the next 5 years. And you might say, well, that's peanuts on a $40 billion endowment, and you're right. But the important element of this case is that in their agreement, Yale acknowledged that this was for tax relief. In almost every other case when a university offers a pilot, they say it's a voluntary contribution, it's a gift. But to say that it's tax relief suggests or makes clear that their withholding of property taxes has a directly adverse effect on the host community. And so now I'm working with activists and community groups in Philadelphia, in Berkeley, California, in New York City, and the list is going on and on and on to try to replicate the New Haven rising story. There's a Massachusetts Action for Pilots campaign. It's statewide that I'm part of right now as well, consulting on. And so because we are a taxpayer nation, I pay my taxes. We all love saying, I'm a tax-paying citizen, as if one is required for the other. What about non-tax-paying? What about rentals? I'm sorry, I'm going off on a tangent. But my point here is that because we love taxes, people are jumping on the pilot piece because that makes sense to them. But as I said before, taxation pilots is just the beginning of the story. It's a provocation to begin asking these questions about the healthcare system, about policing, about labor, suppressed labor on these campuses, which is basically because universities in cities and towns are the biggest employer, real estate holder, healthcare provider, and policer, the decisions that are taking place on these campuses impact the entire cities. And I'm not just talking about Charlottesville or Gainesville or Athens. I'm talking about New York, Chicago, LA, St. Louis, Atlanta, Houston. This is an urban democracy story, but also a rural story. These extensions in these rural areas that are controlled by university hospital extensions and related development, they're also catching hell. And so there's important to duplicate the New Haven rising story. It was a concerted effort. It was community and campus together. That's the only way we can win. That's the only way we can push to make people reconcile that everywhere the university turns, here we are, right. Here we are, here you are, so here we are. That's the only way it can work. But it can't just be a taxation issue. Because as we can see with New Haven, they're paying an additional $10 million, but the residents in New Haven are still catching hell because it needs to be more comprehensive. It's a great win, but it's just the beginning. Oh. Yeah.
Do you expect the power structure to yield to your complaints without your own immediate resolution in order for a reasonable bar?
No. There's going to have to be social protest, agitation. The reason why the New Haven situation worked the way it worked is because everywhere I wrote national op-eds. There was on the ground campaigning. They were embarrassed. They were embarrassed by what happened because we folded into the claims about you claim to serve the public good on a national, international scale. You talk about anti-racism. You have DEI divisions. You do sustainability campaigns. You study health disparities. With all those issues you study internationally exist in your own backyard. How dare you? So leaning into that contradiction was the way in which we were able to win. I was able to help, and they won. But they're not union. So this book, this book ain't winning no awards because book awards are given by universities. And I'm okay with that. My ward is being in places like this, and people saying, you wrote this book, but we hear you. It's exactly what you said. We see this. Can we talk? Let's talk, let's build, let's grow. Let's work on something, even if it's small. How can we include some of this, what you're talking about at the end of the book, and what you're doing in your Smart Cities Lab? How can we build on some of this in our communities? Can we do some forensic accounting about what's the real estate portfolio of the university in our city? Can we do some accounting about to what degree are the hospitals not offering indigent care, and push back against them in a direct way? So to directly answer your question, no, I don't think that they're going to yield, but we're going to win, because the pervasive degree to which these institutions are in our lives and the ways in which they build this wealth on the claims of serving the public, it cannot hold. It can't hold. And if we organize and map and visualize and campaign and build and coordinate with community to community, we're going to win. We're winning. There's a groundswell building. And people are saying after George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, they were like, the first thing they said was, okay, divest from police. But the biggest police in my town is not the city police, it's the campus police. So they said, okay, let's turn to the campus police. Oh, okay. So the police is just the front lines for all this wealth, all this labor, all this healthcare. We need to build and you're seeing this. There's a nationwide movement called Cops Off Campus that's continuing to grow and build. We're gonna start coordinating and developing. We want Charlottesville to be part of the conversation. We want the Jefferson School to be part of the conversation. Momentum is gaining. Of course, there are no guarantees. There never have been social movements. But we know that we are on the right side of justice. And this is a justice issue. This is a racial justice issue, and this is a reparations issue. And my small contribution is to help visualize and to connect the dots. It's the people's job to build momentum and to galvanize the communities to see themselves in these conditions and to demand and expect different outcomes. And that's the final line. You were saying, yes, universities are doing this stuff all the time in symbolic ways, but we have to be outcome-based. If you're doing a turkey giveaway and you're building affordable housing, and yet there's still ain't no Black people on the downtown mall, then your stuff ain't working. If there are no small Black businesses on Main Street, then your outcomes, your efforts ain't working. So we gotta come back and rethink, because we have to look at these things from an outcome perspective. What is our effort? What is our goal? Right? Charlottesville was once a chocolate city. It has to be again. If you don't have workforce housing built into these new developments, shut it down. Right? If the low-wage workers are not making a living wage with 12-month, not 9-month health care and benefits, shut it down. Because at the end of the day, the prosperity of this university is profoundly dependent on Black labor and Black land. The power is with us. It really is. It's just about galvanizing around that power. That's what I believe.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
I'm excited by what you're saying, and I feel a sense of fear and despair, because I think if I try to go tell people about these ideas, they'll say, wait, I just got off my long shift at the hospital, I have to help my kids with my homework, I have to clean my house, and you already talked about the evening meetings where people go after work, and then nothing happens. And so I know that my despair is not your responsibility, and I do believe in prayer and grace. But I'm wondering if you have any thing you want to say in response to what I said.
Well, I think it's important, because one thing that can be done is to go into these communities and talk about the ways in which they're being exploited. That's one thing. But another thing could be to go and to turn inward and to talk amongst ourselves about how we are prospering, how we're prospering in our own communities. Where's that coming from? I love restaurants and the things that are all around, the amenities that are around here. What makes that possible? Can I have these things while still advocating for the quality of life of the workers in these places? Can I, with my time, if I am a retiree, or if I have the privilege of disposable income and time, can I go to the city council meetings and ask these questions? Can I volunteer at the city zoning board or the planning office and ask these questions? Can I be the leverage point to advocate for development without displacement in these areas as all these new developments come online? Can I ask the question? Can I make the demands? And I think that's where we can start. And I think that if you begin there, the residents who have seen the story before, who've been burned, they're like, wow, okay, the white folks are down. They're really doing the work. Let me join them. Let me see what that's about. They're not just talking. They're not just, you say, don't talk about it, be about it. That's where we can start. Because again, the prosperity and the despair are connected. So if we turn inward and begin doing an inventory about how our lifestyles are made possible and begin to beg questions about that, what's the infrastructure that makes it possible, then we begin to turn outward and say, okay, well, how do I equalize this? How do I really enact equity with the grace and the prayer you mentioned? If you're a Christian, how do I walk in Jesus' walk in this world, in a universe city that doesn't care about the least of us? Right? Yeah.
One more? Is there, okay, go ahead.
Hey, Dr. Baldwin, thanks for being here. This is great. One of the things that strikes me is, what makes your message powerful is the work that you've done. You obviously have done the research, you know the numbers, and know the communities. You talk about visualizing and mapping.
Yeah.
Do you have suggestions about how communities can do that?
Yeah.
If they don't have somebody like you right now?
Right. Well, you do have the resources. I would say, like, if you want to begin doing the archival work about the role that university and the city played in, like, Vinegar Hill and Gospel Hill, we're here.
We've got that.
Yeah. And you begin to write op-eds and you partner with graduate students or students at UVA that can do the GIS mapping to visualize the histories. My good peoples up at UVA, Andrew Carl, Claudrina Harold, Deborah McDowell, Ian Grandison, Marlon Ross, they would all be happy to work on these projects, or at least or point to people who would be able to do that work. So you begin to do what I call social footprint mapping, which is a play on carbon footprint mapping, mapping out the real estate, mapping out how far working class residents, workers have to come to work on the medical campus or the university campus. You start to visualize these conditions and you write about them and you galvanize. That's where you can start. You have, the great thing about a university is you have all this knowledge, expertise that you can lean into, and these students can get credit for it. And on the other side, if they're doing this work with communities, imagine how they would visualize and think about the city differently. This will be a real education beyond the bubble. So they do stay. They might be different kinds of neighbors instead of the ones that just want to reproduce the bubble. If they're doing thesis work with Professor Jelaine, right? And they're doing that research in these neighborhoods. What an education. What a real education. And then combine that with going to the county records office, the planning boards, and asking the questions. Because one thing about it is that even though it's a transient life, students are here for 4 years. They vote here. They can go to city council meeting. They can ask questions. You all can ask the questions. I've never been to a place that is more concerned with the urban form than Charlottesville in terms of architectural design. But that doesn't always translate into social economic outcomes. We can have mixed use design, but if you don't have mixed income residency in these designs, it's aesthetics. So we can lean into. My point is that we can lean into these things. We can start small. Like, for example, right now I'm working with the Humanity Action Lab, my lab with Minnesota Transform and the University, Rutgers University Newark, and we're beginning to think about this project we want to build called the Renewal Project. So taking something very specific and focused. The role, that thing I mentioned earlier about the federal law where university became the friendly face of urban renewal policies. So we're gonna do that. We're gonna map it in every place it happened. The university that colluded to change the law, the impacts on the community. We're gonna do before and after time sequencing maps to show the change of elapsed time of the rest of the neighborhoods over time after renewal policies. And we're gonna do this nationally. And it's gonna be called the Renewal Project. And this is gonna be a nationwide project to galvanize and to begin thinking about taking that information and build out a reparations project. That the very prosperity that we can track, the very same neighborhoods that are now prosperous and that are sites of labs and commercial corridors are the very same neighborhoods that were displaced in the 1950s and 60s. So this is what we can do. And we can use artists and dance and spoken word and research. It can be a fully comprehensive testimony, a fully comprehensive experience with something very specific and tangible. Yeah.
So with that, I'd like to thank you all again for being with us. Adrian, we're good?
We're good.
Okay. Tomorrow we're going to have a little bit a more intimate conversation that deals with more deeply with these questions. I think we've got space for like 2 more people. So check our website if you really want to go. I might be able to cut a bagel in half. And thank you very much and have a good evening.
Thank you so much.